The origins of Indians were never as simple as we thought, and ancient DNA reveals why. Where do the people of India actually come from? It sounds like a question with an obvious answer. India is one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. Its scriptures, its languages, its traditions stretch back thousands of years. But for as long as modern people have asked this question, two very different stories have competed for the answer. One says that a group of outsiders called the Aryans swept into the subcontinent from the northwest and built Indian civilization from the ground up. The other insists the opposite, that India's people are entirely indigenous, that the Aryans were born here, and that civilization flowed outward from India to the rest of the world. Ancient DNA has now entered this argument, and it has done something neither side expected. It has shown that both stories are incomplete. The real answer is older, stranger, and far more layered than any political narrative was prepared to admit. A single skeleton pulled from a Bronze Age city in the Indian state of Haryana quietly dismantled decades of assumption, and a wave of large-scale genomic studies published in recent years has revealed something that redraws the entire picture. What the DNA shows is not one origin. There are at least three. And one of the most remarkable aspects of the Indian story is that the social structures built to separate people may have actually preserved the evidence of how those layers came to exist in the first place. To understand this, it helps to look at the land itself. The Indian subcontinent is a geographic funnel. To the north, the Himalayan range forms one of the greatest natural barriers on Earth, sealing the subcontinent from the vast continental interior of Asia. To the south, east, and west, the Indian Ocean closes off three sides. The only realistic land corridors for large-scale ancient movement run through the northwest. The passes and valleys connecting what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan to Central Asia. This geography is not a footnote. It's the reason almost every major migration that shaped South Asia came from the same direction, funneled through the same narrow entry points, and then spread across a landscape of enormous internal diversity. Because the interior of the subcontinent is not uniform either. The Gangetic Plain stretches across the north like a wide corridor. The Deccan Plateau rises through central India. The Western Ghats run down the southwestern coast. The Thar Desert seals off the northwest. These geographic compartments shaped how populations moved, where they settled, where they stayed isolated for centuries, and where they mixed. The result is what researchers today describe as one of the most genetically diverse countries on Earth, home to more than 4 billion people, roughly 5,000 distinct ethno-linguistic and caste communities, and a population structure that carries the imprint of migrations reaching back 50,000 years. That phrase, 50,000 years, matters, because this is where the story of India's people actually begins. When researchers analyze the deepest layer of South Asian ancestry, they find a population that geneticists call the Ancient Ancestral South Indians, or AASI. These were hunter-gatherers who entered the subcontinent roughly 50,000 years ago as part of the same out-of-Africa dispersal that eventually carried our species across the world. Research now suggests that most of the genetic variation found across modern India traces back to this single founding wave. Earlier migration attempts appear to have left very little detectable trace in living populations. These were not a marginal group clinging to a few riverbanks. They spread across the entire subcontinent. They became the foundational layer of South Asia's human story, present everywhere from the high northwest to the southern tip of the peninsula. The closest living window into what this ancient population looked like genetically may be the indigenous people of the Andaman Islands. These remote islands in the Bay of Bengal have been largely isolated from the major migrations that reshaped mainland India over thousands of years. Their DNA carries proportions of AASI-related ancestry not found in quite the same form anywhere else. In a very real sense, the Andamanese represent an echo of a South Asia that existed before farming, before cities, before any of the migrations that followed. But those migrations were coming. Around 10,000 years ago, a second layer began to appear in the ancestral record. Ancient Iranian-related farmers, a lineage that had diverged from other populations on the Iranian plateau deep in the Neolithic period, began moving toward the subcontinent's northwestern corridor. They brought agricultural knowledge with them, but the picture is more complicated than a simple population takeover. Ancient DNA from sites associated with the Indus Valley suggests that farming in the subcontinent may have spread partly through cultural exchange and possibly through independent local development, rather than being carried entirely by mass migration. The incoming Iranian-related ancestry mixed with the AASI people already living across the northwest. Over generations, this combination produced the population that would eventually build one of the ancient world's most extraordinary civilizations, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, the Indus Valley Civilization. By around 2600 BCE, these cities had populations that researchers estimate reached between 40,000 and 50,000 people each. They had planned street grids, brick drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, and long-distance trade networks stretching to Mesopotamia. They were contemporaries of ancient Egypt, and in some respects more systematically organized. This was not a primitive settlement. It was an urban civilization of real sophistication, built by a people who were already themselves a mixture, the product of ancient South Asian hunter-gatherers and Iranian plateau farmers coming together across generations. And then, a single burial site in the village of Rakhigarhi, in the modern Indian state of Haryana, changed the conversation. In 2019, researchers published the analysis of ancient DNA extracted from a 4,500-year-old skeleton found at Rakhigarhi, a major Indus Valley civilization site. The result was striking. This individual, who lived at what may have been one of the Indus Valley civilization's largest urban centers, carried no detectable steppe ancestry, none. The migration that would eventually reshape northern India had not yet arrived. The Great Bronze Age civilization was still intact, and the people living inside it carried no trace of what was about to come. That migration came roughly 4,000 years ago, as the Indus Valley civilization entered its period of decline. From the vast grasslands stretching between Eastern Europe and Central Asia, a region called the Pontic-Caspian Steppe, populations of nomadic pastoralists had been expanding outward for centuries. These groups, related to the people archaeologists associate with the Yamnaya culture, had already begun spreading westward into Europe. Now a branch of their descendants moved southeast through the passes and corridors of Central Asia and entered the Indian subcontinent through the same northwestern gateway that had channeled migrations for tens of thousands of years. The genetic signature they carried, what researchers call steppe ancestry, matches almost exactly the same profile found in Bronze Age populations of Eastern Europe. This is not a coincidence. It reflects a single dispersal event that reshaped two continents almost simultaneously. The languages these people spoke almost certainly belonged to the Indo-European family. When they moved west, their language eventually gave rise to Greek, Latin, the Germanic tongues, the Slavic languages, and eventually English. When they moved southeast into South Asia, their language gave rise to Sanskrit and eventually to Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, Bengali, and the other Indo-European languages spoken across northern India today. That is the connection. The reason Hindi and English share ancient linguistic roots is not metaphor. It is the genetic and cultural residue of a migration that happened 4,000 years ago on the Eurasian steppe. But here's what the DNA also shows. This was not a conquest that erased what came before. The steppe migrants mixed with the IVC-descended populations still living across the northwest. The evidence suggests this admixture may have been significantly male-biased. The steppe ancestral signal appears more strongly in paternal lineages than in maternal ones, hinting that men from the steppe entered existing communities, rather than entire steppe family groups displacing local ones. The result of this mixing in the northwest was what geneticists call ancestral North Indians, or ANI, a population carrying both IVC-related and steppe-related ancestry. At roughly the same time, IVC-related people who had moved south and east during the civilization's decline mixed with communities carrying higher proportions of the oldest AASI ancestry. This southern mixing produced the population researchers call Ancestral South Indians, or ASI. These two ancestral populations then continued to mix with each other across the subcontinent for centuries, and this is where something extraordinary happened. Research suggests that somewhere around 1900 to 4200 years ago, the mixing largely stopped. Social and cultural practices, particularly endogamy, the custom of marrying within one's own community, became enforced across large parts of South Asia. The caste system, as it solidified over time, effectively froze these layered ancestries in place. The genetic consequence is remarkable. Research has found that genetic differences between caste communities, even those living near each other, can be striking, a direct result of thousands of years of endogamy preserving ancient ancestry layers in distinct social groups. The caste system was and remains a source of profound inequality. But from a purely scientific vantage point, it has also inadvertently produced one of the most detailed living records of ancient human population structure anywhere on Earth. Those layers look different depending on where in India you stand. Research confirms what geneticists describe as the Indian cline, a gradient running roughly north to south, correlating with proportions of ANI versus ASI ancestry. In general, populations in northern India carry higher proportions of steppe-related and Iranian farmer-related ancestry. Populations in southern India, particularly Dravidian language speakers, such as Tamil, Kannada, and Telugu communities, carry higher proportions of ASI ancestry, reflecting the older AASI and IVC-related layers that mixed more heavily in the south. Certain tribal populations in southern India carry the highest proportions of AASI-related ancestry found anywhere on the mainland, making them living genetic windows into South Asia before farming and before the steppe migration. The Northeast tells a different story. A third cluster, shaped by ancient connections to Southeast Asian populations, reflects the eastern corridors of movement that have always existed alongside the better documented northwestern ones, and none of these patterns respect modern national borders. Genetic zones that formed over thousands of years of migration and isolation do not stop at the line between India and Pakistan, or India and Bangladesh, or India and Sri Lanka. Now consider how this evidence reshapes the old arguments. The colonial era Aryan invasion model imagined a conquering group of outsiders arriving to replace or dominate a passive indigenous population. But the DNA does not show replacement, it shows a mixture. The original populations of South Asia, the descendants of those ancient hunter-gatherers and Indus Valley civilization builders, were not swept away. They form the genetic backbone of modern South Asians, North and South alike. The Hindu nationalist counter-narrative insists that the people of India are entirely indigenous, without outside contribution. But the DNA does not support this either. The Iranian farmer-related ancestry present across South Asia arrived from outside the subcontinent. The steppe ancestry present most strongly in northern India also arrived from outside. These are ancient migrations, not recent invasions. And carrying their genetic legacy does not make anyone less Indian in any meaningful cultural or historical sense. It simply means the population history of South Asia is older and more connected to the rest of the world than any closed origin story allows. The idea that North and South Indians are fundamentally different peoples also softens under the genetic evidence. Both carry the same three foundational ancestry sources. The proportions differ, the ingredients do not. What current science supports is something more layered than any of the competing myths imagined. Roughly 50,000 years ago, the first modern humans to reach South Asia spread across a subcontinent that had been empty of our species. Their descendants became the foundation on which everything else would be built. Thousands of years later, ancient farmers related to populations on the Iranian plateau moved into the northwest and mixed with those older hunter-gatherers, producing the population that eventually raised the cities of the Indus Valley civilization. Then, roughly 4,000 years ago, steppe pastoralists arrived through the northwestern corridors, bringing a new ancestry and a new language family, one that would eventually connect Hindi to English and Sanskrit to Russian. The older IVC-related populations absorbed this ancestry in the north, while their southern relatives mixed more deeply with ancient hunter-gatherer descendants, producing the ASI lineage. All of these mixed populations then came together across the subcontinent in varying proportions, before endogamy gradually preserved those proportions as distinct community signatures that persist to this day. I want to slow down for a moment here and talk about what it actually means for a geneticist to reconstruct something like this, because it's easy to hear these numbers and these ancestry labels and lose sight of just how remarkable the underlying method is. Scientists aren't just guessing at population movements based on pottery styles or old texts anymore. They're extracting actual genetic material from bones and teeth that are thousands of years old, sequencing it, and comparing it statistically against thousands of modern and ancient genomes from around the world. When they say a population carries steppe ancestry, they mean they can trace specific genetic markers back to skeletons excavated from burial mounds on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, dated using radiocarbon methods, and matched against the DNA of people living in Punjab or Uttar Pradesh today. That's an extraordinary chain of evidence, and it's part of why this field has become so powerful over the last decade. It's also worth pausing on just how unusual India's genetic landscape is in a global context. Most countries, even large and diverse ones, don't preserve population history in quite this way. In many parts of the world, people have mixed relatively freely for centuries, blurring the genetic signatures of ancient migrations into a smoother, less distinct gradient. India is different precisely because of endogamy. The very institution that restricted marriage across community lines for thousands of years also acted, unintentionally, as a kind of genetic time capsule. Each caste and community became a semi-isolated population because these populations rarely exchanged genes with one another after a certain point in history. The ancestry proportions present at the time endogamy took hold have been remarkably well preserved. That's why researchers can look at two communities living a few kilometers apart in the same Indian city and find genetic differences that, in some cases, rival the differences between entire countries in other parts of the world. It's a strange and double-edged legacy. A social system responsible for enormous injustice has also left behind one of the richest natural archives of ancient human movement anywhere on the planet. This also helps explain why the debate over Indian origins has been so politically charged for so long. The Aryan invasion theory, as it was originally framed by 19th and early 20th century colonial scholars, wasn't just a scientific hypothesis. It was tangled up with racial theories of the era, with ideas about civilizational superiority, and later with justifications for colonial rule itself. It's no surprise that this framing provoked a strong backlash in post-colonial India, and that backlash eventually produced the out-of-India theory, which flipped the narrative entirely and argued that Indo-European languages and peoples originated within India and spread outward. Both of these narratives were shaped as much by politics and identity as by evidence. What ancient DNA has done is strip away a lot of that baggage and replace it with something messier, more nuanced, and honestly more interesting than either origin story allowed for. It's also worth noting what the DNA doesn't tell us, because that matters too. Genetics can tell you about ancestry proportions, about which populations mixed with which, and roughly when that mixing happened. It cannot tell you what language a particular ancient skeleton spoke, what religion they practiced, or what they called themselves. Those questions require archaeology, linguistics, and textual analysis working alongside genetics, not replacing it. So, when researchers talk about steppe ancestry arriving in South Asia around 4,000 years ago and connect that to the spread of Indo-European languages, they're drawing on multiple independent lines of evidence that happen to converge on the same timeline and the same geographic corridor, not claiming that DNA alone can prove what language someone spoke. That convergence across disciplines is part of what makes the current picture so compelling, but it's worth being precise about what each type of evidence can and can't tell us. The diversity of India, its hundreds of languages, its thousands of communities, its regional differences, its ancient tribal groups, is not an accident. It is the consequence of 50,000 years of movement, adaptation, convergence, and survival on a subcontinent shaped by mountains, rivers, deserts, and ocean. The country name on the map is real. The culture is real. The history is real. But beneath it, the DNA reveals something no single origin story could have predicted. A layering of ancestry so old and so deep that the question of where Indians come from does not have one answer. It has at least three. And each one is older and stranger than the myth that came before it. If this story made you see India differently, there are dozens more waiting for you on this channel. Every nation has a hidden genetic history. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you know someone who would find this fascinating, send it to them.